welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, a quick note to our listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show or even leaving a positive review. It really does help sustain our work. And if you'd like to explore all the other topics we've covered in the past, you can find a full archive of the show at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. One of President Joe Biden's first decisions after taking office in January was to agree with Russia on extending the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Better known as New START, it is the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the U.S. and Russia, and it verifiably limits each country to no more than 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads and 700 deployed delivery systems. The renewal of New START was widely welcomed by arms control experts given its important role in limiting the number of deployed nuclear weapons, but it remains unclear how much further progress Biden can make beyond New START, partly due to the high tension in the U.S. Russia relationship on a host of other issues. Joining me today to talk about the prospects for Biden's arms control and nonproliferation agenda with Russia is Sarah Bidgood. She's the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. Sarah, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks, Elliot.
In terms of nuclear arms control, the most urgent item on Biden's agenda was renewing New START. There were initially some reports during the post-election transition period that the Biden administration might opt for a shorter period of extension, less than the full 5 years, in an effort to maybe gain leverage over the Kremlin. Instead, Biden agreed to extend the agreement for a full 5 years as one of his first actions in office during the first few weeks. What was your reaction to that development? Were you surprised?
You know, I wasn't particularly surprised by it, but I have to say I was quite relieved as somebody who focuses on sort of U.S. Russian arms control and ways to facilitate more ambitious agreements in that area. For me, you know, the bottom line is that arms control and New START remain very much in the U.S. national security interest. That agreement constrains Russia. It makes financial sense for the United States because it doesn't have to race Russia on all fronts. And it adds a degree of stability and predictability to the U.S.-Russian relationship at a time when I think that's really necessary. So when you think about all of these benefits, you know, for me, I think it would have been really short-sighted to sort of give up the opportunity to continue to reap those for another 5 years. And when you look at it from that perspective, you know, extending the treaty wasn't an act of altruism, but rather, you know, something more like an act of pragmatism. I think it's also worth remembering that, you know, just because New START was extended doesn't mean that policymakers in Washington and Moscow can't or shouldn't start working on what's going to come after that. Those aren't two mutually exclusive options. And to, you know, use a really overused cliche, we can walk and chew gum at the same time on this issue.
You mentioned the renewal of New START potentially putting some stability into the relationship, which I think it's fair to say is pretty badly needed. How would you characterize the relationship right now? Is it historically low? Is it like the worst it's ever been? What would you describe it as?
That's a great question. You know, it's a little bit hard for me to say because I'm a child of the 80s. And what everybody has told me is that, you know, when you hear the United States and Russia sort of going at it, it really sounds quite a bit like what you might have heard at the height of the Cold War and even sort of in the 1960s at some of these most difficult moments of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. What I see personally from where I sit is, you know, a total lack of trust between the United States and Russia, real acrimony in the relationship that is interfering with the way that we do arms control and the ability of both sides to come to an agreement, even when it would appear to be in their national security interest. And just sort of a lack of respect for one another, I think, that permeates all aspects of the relationship. So it is really problematic. I can't say for sure how it compares to some of the worst moments in the Cold War, but it's certainly a very, very dangerous time.
Biden made pretty clear, even during the campaign, that arms control was a priority for him, and his former boss, Barack Obama, also made this a priority. What was the calculus like on the Russian side? What was in it for the Kremlin to agree to this speedy renewal for a full 5 years of New START?
Well, I mean, obviously I'm sitting here in Monterey, California, and I don't have, the full perspective from Moscow. But I would have to imagine that the calculus is pretty similar to what I described at the top. So you have an agreement that allows for a degree of stability and predictability in the relationship with the United States. It exempts Russia from having to compete with the United States on all fronts in the arms control arena and in the arms race more broadly. And it's something that Russia has continually said that they were interested in from the period of time when negotiations were ongoing under the Trump administration. So for me, it wasn't very surprising to see Russia take the Biden administration up on their sort of interest in extending New START. That to me didn't seem like it was something out of the blue. It seemed like something that was very much in line with what we had been hearing from the Kremlin over the last several years.
In terms of this dynamic of the renewal of New START putting a floor, if we can call it that, on the decline in bilateral relations, I'm wondering if that also might cut the other way with the overall chilly atmosphere between Washington and Moscow having a detrimental impact on efforts to move the ball forward on nuclear arms reduction beyond New START, because obviously New START doesn't cover all the nuclear weapons in both countries' arsenals. So do you see that overall dynamic in the relationship negatively affecting new rounds of arms control talks in the future?
Elliot, I worry that it will, but I don't think that has to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, during the Cold War, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union, who were, the two largest nuclear weapon states who had this very acrimonious relationship, still managed to work together very closely on ambitious arms control agreements, on transparency and confidence building measures, on risk reduction measures, in part because policymakers on both sides were often able to delink nuclear issues from kind of the broader high political environment. My understanding from what the Biden administration has been saying around the extension of New START is that they are prepared to try to pursue, both ambitious arms control with Russia and simultaneously, to kind of use their words, to hold Russia to account for its actions in other areas. I think that can work, but if the past tells us anything, it's that approach is going to require a couple of key things. It's going to require strong institutional advocates for nuclear cooperation who can help to sustain cooperation even when the going gets rough. It's going to require personal relationships between individuals in both Washington and Moscow who are able to sustain engagement even during difficult times in that relationship. And I think, most fundamentally, it's going to require a really clear-eyed view of the areas where the two sides perceive shared threats and a coincidence of interests. Those areas can be found. We just have to look for them. And that's part of the reason, to get back to your earlier question about New START, where I'm glad to see that we will have that channel for ongoing kind of communication and feeling out of one another's priorities over the next 5 years.
Digging into that a little bit more specifically, what kind of approach do you think has the potential to really help the two sides advance on this issue, overcoming the bilateral tensions that there might be in other areas?
So that's an interesting question, because I think there are a couple of different philosophies here. One of the ones that I find to be the most compelling is this idea of sort of exercising unilateral restraint to really help to get the ball rolling, to get the relationship back to a point where you can do the types of ambitious arms control that we're going to need in the current security environment. In my own research, I'm especially interested in an approach from the Cold War called GRIT, which is, of course, because it's our field, an acronym.
A very fitting acronym, if I might
add. Exactly. So GRIT stands for Graduated Reciprocation in Tension Reduction, and it was really this idea that a psychologist came up with in the 1960s to try to encourage the United States and the then Soviet Union to engage in unilateral acts of sort of disarmament as a way of reducing the perceived threats of the other side and inviting the other side to engage in reciprocal action. The benefit of this approach is that it can really help to build trust when there is no sense of trust in the relationship. But it also allows both sides a great deal of flexibility. So if I'm a policymaker sitting in Washington, for example, I can decide, here are a menu of options where I am able to demonstrate some degree of unilateral restraint, and I can make the decisions about those which I feel are sufficient to change Russia's perceived threats without making me in the United States overly vulnerable in case Russia isn't interested in playing ball. So I think that's one approach that could be really effective in the current environment. It's also responsive to new economic restraints that we're probably going to see facing both the United States and Russia. So that's something that I hope policymakers are able to explore, because I think it has a lot of promise.
So these would be unilateral actions, in other words, taken without necessarily consulting or securing an agreement from the other side first. What might that look like, and how would either side telegraph to the other the intention of these moves?
That's a great question, and it's one that, in fact, the originator of GRIT lays out some very careful rules around. So in order for GRIT to actually work, you're exactly right. Both sides have to identify this menu of options of unilateral restraint. They have to announce them publicly, and they have to invite the other side to reciprocate with their own parallel option. It doesn't have to be exactly the same step, but it does need to be something that is comparable in terms of its scope. So I can think of a number of different examples that the United States could explore at the present moment, for instance, if it wanted to initiate a GRIT strategy vis-a-vis Moscow. For one thing, it could consider canceling the development and the production of the new missile that's part of the ground-based strategic deterrent, and instead decide to extend the life of the Minuteman III ICBM. It could also consider doing things like limiting the deployment of the SM-3 Block 2A ballistic missile defense interceptor, which has now been tested, as you know, against an ICBM range target that I worry could fuel the development of Russian weapons.
Was that the test that they did in Alaska some months ago? Am I thinking of the right one?
I don't think it was in Alaska. I'd have to actually check where it was. I feel like it was in Guam, to be honest with you, but I'd want to check that before. But yeah, basically, they tested it against an ICBM range target, which is the exact scenario that Russia has always expressed concerns about with respect to ballistic missile defense, which is that all of a sudden they would threaten Russia's strategic deterrent. So I think there are ways that the United States could consider, possibly changing its thinking around the deployment of this interceptor in ways that wouldn't hurt U.S. national security interests. And that's really the key kind of guiding principle for GRIT. You don't want to make yourself vulnerable in case the other side isn't interested in reciprocating.
Regardless of whether the U.S. makes itself vulnerable by such an action, I can definitely hear, even now, the howls of protest from Capitol Hill that might ensue at whatever action the Biden administration takes, arguing that they're opening the United States up to, falling behind vis-a-vis the deterrent with Russia or what have you. How might that political obstacle obstruct this strategy?
Well, that's definitely something to be considered. And that's always been a criticism of GRIT ever since the get-go, is that, in a moment when the United States and then Soviet, or the United States and Russian relationship is in really bad straits, that's not the time to all of a sudden, start taking action that could inadvertently make you more vulnerable or shake the confidence of your allies who are relying on your extended deterrent. I think there are some other competing and equally compelling arguments on the other side, though. And chief among these is one that I've alluded to in our conversation earlier, and that's economics. I don't think in the post-COVID environment that it is going to be possible for the United States to not only compete in, but win at a nuclear arms race in an era of great power competition. I think there are going to need to be some really tough trade-offs between certain types of capabilities. We're going to have to take a close look at what capabilities are actually necessary to maintain a credible deterrent. And I think if we take that close look at what our real defense needs are, it will point us in the direction of things that can be cut that we don't necessarily need in order to feel safe and secure. And those are the types of things that could become the fodder for a grit-like approach to Russia.
In a way, it does fit in well with the approach that Biden has laid out, this idea of a foreign policy that works for the middle class, that avoids sort of unnecessary arms expenditures. I'm thinking of, for instance, how the F-35 program has just gotten a ton of bad press for being this sort of bloated project that just racks up expense after expense after expense. It seems like that could be an approach that could be marketed well to the domestic political base.
That's what I think, too. I mean, of course, it remains to be seen, and defense spending is, always a touchy issue because it affects communities in the United States, too. So it isn't just about considerations having to do with our national defense. It has to do with constituent voters in those places in the United States that house a large part of our defense footprint. And I get that. But I do think it is, as you said, in line with the type of approach that the Biden administration appears to be sort of espousing. And I think it has this other benefit of allowing a great deal of flexibility to the side that is initiating the strategy or the side that's reciprocating, because you aren't obligated to be in lockstep with your adversary. You're just obligated to some extent to reciprocate to their actions in the interest of building trust.
It seems to me that the economic argument plays well, too, on the Russian side, given what I know about the current situation that the Russian economy is in and President Putin's budget. For all the tough talk from the Kremlin, there isn't necessarily a lot of room in the budget for really beefing up the nuclear weapons arsenal in Russia.
That's exactly right. And we know, too, I mean, just from reading media reports in the Russian media and things that have been translated into the English media, that, they've faced setbacks from the COVID-19 pandemic as well that have had an influence on their ability to, carry out tests of new weapon systems and things like that. I mean, just like everybody is seeing all over the world, the pandemic and social distancing and the fact that people are not necessarily, healthy and feeling their best has implications that span the defense industry and the defense industrial complex. So I think, it's unfortunate that this strategy is necessary because of the influence that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the global community. But I also think that is a pretty compelling rationale for policymakers and lawmakers who might otherwise be skeptical.
I want to move to a different agreement that the U.S. and Russia had previously before the Trump administration withdrew from, and now Russia is withdrawing from, which is the Open Skies Treaty. It doesn't deal with nuclear weapons, so it might not be quite as familiar to a lot of listeners as New START. But the Biden administration has sent some pretty strong signals that it has no intention to re-enter this after first criticizing the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from it. Can you first talk a little bit about how this agreement came about and what it does or did before the two most important members pulled out?
Sure. So the Open Skies Treaty was signed in 1992. So it's a post-Soviet, post-Cold War treaty. It entered into force in 2002, but it was actually the brainchild of Dwight Eisenhower. So it's not a wholly new idea. And the basic gist of Open Skies is that each state party is allowed to conduct short notice reconnaissance flights over each other's territory to collect data on their military forces and their activities. And you do this using special planes that have been outfitted with sensors that can identify different types of, military equipment like combat aircraft or combat vehicles, things like that. And listeners might be thinking, why wouldn't you just do this with satellite imagery? And it is true that, for the United States, for example, our satellites are much more sensitive and much more able to see what's on the ground than perhaps these specially outfitted airplanes can. But it's worth remembering that not all of the state parties to Open Skies have those kinds of capabilities. And part of the objective of the treaty is actually to build confidence among the participants in the agreement. So the data that are gathered in these overflights are accessible to all states parties. So that kind of adds this additional confidence building measure to the treaty. And the the idea here is that all of the states parties are allowed to conduct a certain number of overflights so they can fly over other countries. That's what's called their active quota. But those same states also have to accept a certain number of overflights over their territory, and that's what's called the passive quota. So it's really in large part about building confidence. It's something that America's allies have said they hope the United States remains in. Obviously, that is no longer as straightforward as it might have been before the Trump administration withdrew. But my understanding is that there are a couple of different sort of legal measures that the Biden administration could take with sufficient political will that would allow it to rejoin the treaty.
Before we get to that, I wanted to ask you what you make of the reasoning that the Biden administration has put forth for apparently not being too keen on rejoining the treaty. There was a memo that was reported a couple weeks ago in Defense News from the State Department, reportedly telling U.S. partners in Europe, OST signatories, that the U.S. rejoining now would, quote, send the wrong message to Russia and undermine our position on the broader arms control agenda, end quote. What do you make of that?
I honestly don't know what to make of that, because it doesn't really sound to me like the same sort of clear-eyed and pragmatic language that I heard around the Biden administration's extension of New START. To me, the extension of New START sounded like, okay, we recognize that we have bigger problems in the U.S.-Russian relationship that aren't just going to go away, but let's set those aside for the moment in the interest of pursuing this agreement that appears to be in both of our national security interests. I'm not exactly sure why a similar logic wouldn't apply with respect to open skies, especially considering that U.S. allies have said that they want the United States to be a part of that treaty. It also strikes me, just sort of more generally, that being in a treaty allows you to exert pressure on the other parties to comply with its terms in a way that you can't do when you have extricated yourself from the treaty and are no longer a party. So to me, it seems like the Biden administration, if it is indeed concerned that Russia is violating that treaty, would have greater leverage to help bring them back into compliance if it remained part of the treaty rather than continuing to uphold the position that was espoused by the Trump administration.
It also seems like staying in this treaty, or returning to this treaty, rather, might be consistent with the Biden administration's desire to sort of rekindle and strengthen ties with its NATO allies, which frayed a bit under the Trump administration. And as you mentioned, this was an agreement that was seen within NATO as quite valuable.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's really something to consider here, too, is that, of course, arms control isn't just about the relationship between the two parties that are, perhaps in an adversarial relationship. It's also about the perceived threats of American allies and of NATO countries. So it's important for NATO countries to see, for example, that the United States and the Russian Federation are interested in cooperating in the interest of international security. And that's part of why arms control sends a valuable message to, for example, states parties in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as you said, allied relations with the United States did fray somewhat under the Trump administration. I think there were concerns to some extent about the credibility of the security guarantees that the United States had made to NATO under Trump. And this strikes me, the Open Skies Treaty, strikes me as an opportunity to really shore those up and bolster them at a time when I think that would mean quite a bit to NATO.
You mentioned earlier some legal options that might be available to the Biden administration to potentially return to the agreement. What might those be?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I will caveat my legal knowledge with that little tidbit. But my understanding is that there are really sort of two options for the Biden administration at this point. One would be to rejoin the treaty, to re-sign it and re-ratify it, which of course would require it going back to the Senate for ratification, which, as we know, has been particularly challenging for arms control agreements in recent memory. But the other option that I believe is available to the Biden administration would be for Biden to rejoin by means of an executive order. So this wouldn't require the treaty to go back to the Senate floor for advice and consent. It would just be an executive order that would allow the United States to rejoin the treaty. But again, this is not my specific area of expertise, so I want to caveat anything I'm saying with that knowledge.
I'm sure members of the Senate would be overjoyed if Biden tried to do something like that to bypass them.
Yeah, exactly right.
So we focused so far in this conversation on two big agreements that obviously are very important to the issue of arms control and nuclear arms reduction between the U.S. and Russia. What are some other trends or flashpoints that you're keeping an eye on with regard to these issues, either with regard to U.S. Russia relations or broader on a multilateral front?
Yeah, so one of the big ones that my colleagues and I have been focused on recently is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's a treaty that was concluded in 1970. It's 50 years old. And essentially it governs, who can have nuclear weapons and who can't have nuclear weapons. And the main core provision of the treaty is that countries that don't have nuclear weapons can't get them, and countries that have nuclear weapons can't give them to countries that don't. So the treaty gets reviewed every 5 years, and we were actually supposed to have the 50th anniversary of the treaty in 2020. But of course, like everything else, it was canceled or postponed because of the pandemic. So we're actually supposed to be coming up on the now 2021 NPT review conference in August of this year. And so I'm looking closely to understand what the diverse perspectives are of the states parties that belong to that treaty. You have countries that are very interested in and have ratified the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that makes nuclear weapons illegal. And then on the other hand, you have the United States and the Russian Federation, which still possess the vast majority of the global nuclear stockpile. So for somebody like me who's really interested in understanding what are the drivers behind states' behavior on the international stage, particularly as it relates to nuclear weapons, this is a great opportunity for me to understand what some of the hot topics are, where the main fault lines are that are dividing states parties, and what some of the big challenges are going to be for the United States and Russia in this new era to tackle together. One of the areas that I think is going to be particularly important at this review conference is nuclear risk reduction. So we've been talking so far about ways to, reduce the type or quantity of nuclear weapons. Risk reduction is really about making sure that they don't get used, making sure that by some accident or mistake or miscalculation or miscommunication, countries don't inadvertently launch a nuclear weapon. And the reason I think this is going to be such a hot topic at the NPT is in part because we're at a time when it's very difficult, or seems to be very difficult, for the United States and Russia to conclude arms control agreements. We're not seeing new ambitious arms control agreements. We're seeing the maintenance of the arms control regime such as it is. And that's what we began our conversation with New START. Nuclear risk reduction then seems like an appropriate response to me for a time when you have increasing mistrust and acrimony between the United States and Russia, between the United States, Russia, and China. And you need to make sure that that acrimony and mistrust isn't going to inadvertently increase the risk of nuclear danger. So those are two of the kind of interlinked issues that I'm keeping a close eye on. I'm going to be listening out to understand what states parties hope to get out of this meeting and what they see as the main threats to the international security environment today. And hopefully, as a person who's interested in looking at ways to revive U.S. Russian cooperation on nuclear issues, that'll give all of us some ideas about areas of coincidence that these two nuclear weapon states could tackle together.
In terms of non-proliferation, we also see the prospects for the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as it's officially known, really in the headlines in recent weeks as the parties are trying to find ways to salvage it, to try to find terms under which the U.S. could rejoin and Iran could come back into compliance. Then you also have the ever-present issue of North Korea's nuclear program, which continues to develop at a pretty rapid clip. How do you see the U.S. and Russia cooperating on these two areas, which are very key areas that both of them have a pretty large stake in?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Elliot. I mean, to me, it seems like it's very clear that the United States and the Russian Federation would both have an interest in, preventing Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold and helping to facilitate an environment where North Korea is able to disarm and feels pressure to disarm. So those are two areas for me where I think the United States and the Russian Federation should have the potential to find some common ground on which to cooperate. I think the real challenge will be keeping these larger issues in the U.S.-Russian relationship from interfering with these areas of cooperation that seem like they would make so much sense from the standpoint of an objective observer. And it kind of remains to be seen whether the United States and Russia are going to be able to come together and work cooperatively as they did in the past on both of these issues. We'll have to keep our eyes on that space.
Sarah, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Elliot.
Sarah Bidgood is the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's, 1 T, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.